A beautiful July morning it is, and another beautiful morning we could sit back and relax and listen to the Dear Church podcast. Right, Pastor Gene?
Righto.
So let's get right to it. You are listening to the Dear Church podcast.
Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.
Welcome to the Dear Church podcast, where we exist to fill your ears and your minds with the study of God to see the world as disciples of Christ. My name is Sam Yang.
And I'm Sam Yang.
Oh, no. Pastor Eugene. How come you don't say Eugene? It's Eugene. How come you don't do that?
I don't know. That's just how you say it.
Didn't you say some people call you Eugene? Didn't you say that?
Yep.
Oh. But Pastor Eugene, I wanted to discuss the music change that we've had going on for this week and the previous week. The past year, we've had a recording of our beloved praise team playing God Be Praised. And that was our intro, but we changed our introduction. As per your wise and great advice. And we're going to be using a recording from the previous Sunday where we can hear the congregation sing. And that is a beautiful idea, in my humble opinion. So that is why we have changed the music. It is for a beautiful reason. So we hope you enjoy. Pastor Eugene, we're going to be continuing to talk about the current events that are happening in our world. And we're going to be talking about the royal couple today.
How long are we going to do current events for? Is it while Al Mohler's taking a break?
We're picking up the mantle. But I think just a couple of weeks during the summer is what we had. Because we do have a lot of other things and topics that we do want to talk about. But just during the summer for a couple of weeks, we wanted to talk about just the news that are happening every week around our world. The news that is happening every week around our world. And we are taking our attention to the royal couple, Prince Henry and Meghan Markle. They've actually been in the news quite often this past year. But we're going to be talking about an award they won recently. They won a humanitarian award. And the reason why they won this humanitarian award was because they had promised to only have 2 kids. And that's why they won this humanitarian award. And so I wanted to talk about that. Why in our world is it applauded and lauded when we have less children?
I think it has a lot to do with the current movement and everybody's, I would say it's almost like a frenzy, an alarm over global warming, right?
Yeah, or just the environmental impact I think the kids have. So I wanted to get into that as well. People say that having more kids is just having less kids is more environmentally friendly. And I've even heard of reasons for not having kids, and they don't want to bring babies into this cruel world. But whatever their reason might be, whether it's this environmental reason or this false moral reason, whatever it might be, it seems to go against God's command in Genesis to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the basic foundation that I wanted to talk about today. What does this command mean? And are we to apply this command today?
Always. Whatever God's command is, we always apply it, right? So there isn't anything that just disappears. So, yeah, if God says it, we listen to it and obey it.
So I guess my question with that is, when we see that command, it's with Adam and Eve and with Noah, I believe. And when we see that command, the context might tell us there's a specific reason why God commanded those specific people in that specific time. Adam and Eve, obviously, to fill the earth because they were the first human beings that we read of in the Bible. And then also Noah, because after the flood, everyone was dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would have, there is a reason for God to say, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, because people weren't filling the earth. But I guess the argument could be, well, today people are filling the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so is this command a temporary command for that specific context, or is this something that we obey today specifically as well?
Give me a command for a temporary context.
That wasn't explicitly fulfilled.
I don't know.
Because I mean,
Anything
we
temporary.
could say like, dietary restrictions, but that was explicitly fulfilled.
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Acts.
that was fulfilled. It pointed to Christ.
Right.
It pointed to his finished work.
Yeah.
Things like that. I would think it would be kind of an absurd correlation to make that Christ has fulfilled babies, the command to multiply, right?
So we would then say that this command still holds true today, like you were saying before.
Right. This is a biblical worldview that the world is rejecting, among many.
Yeah. So there are many couples today, married couples, that are not against the idea of having children because they are a blessing, but they are timing it, or they're planning for it. They're scheduling it. And they're using contraceptives to do so. And I know that we briefly went over, the discussion on contraceptives during our live recording at America's Keswick.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go a little bit deeper into that because there were, I think, some follow-up questions to that. If then would it be wrong for us then to plan, let's say? I think we could just start there.
No. Yeah, I don't think it's wrong to plan. I think it's wise to always plan. The method of planning is something that you want to bring up, right?
Right.
But so it should start with the biblical worldview. It should start with the Christian understanding that children are a blessing from the Lord. That's from Psalm 128, right? No, 128 and even 127. 127, 3-5 is a very classic chunk of verses that we read when a baby is born. I've done it many times too when we bless a newborn baby.
Let me read that for us. Psalm 127, verse 3-5 reads, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate."
And then 128, 3-4.
128, 3-4 reads, "Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord."
Yeah, this is a blessing that God gives for those who are obedient to his command to be fruitful and multiply. There's an aspect of, you can't get around the physical aspect.
Yeah.
But there's also the spiritual aspect, because when you raise physical children, you're also raising them spiritually, right? And so those two dimensions are there for parents to understand, for families to recognize as they grow physically and spiritually.
So you brought up the different types of contraceptives that Christian couples may be using. And I just wanted to, I guess, just go into detail about that. I know that some may use birth control pills. Some may use forms of condoms and stuff like that. Are these all okay for us to use within a Christian worldview?
It depends. I think we talked about it, but if they're abortifacient, that means they can get rid of a baby, those pills, right?
The day after pill.
Or it could even be something that, gets rid of any kind of, when it sticks to the lining of the uterus, right?
Yep.
And so there are pills that do that. We call those abortifacients, but you have to watch out for that.
Yeah.
Even John Piper talks about that, and then he shares about his personal experiences and his wife. And if that was the case, then he has a lot to repent for. But, that being the case, I think it's more important to understand how children are a blessing from the Lord because it is a command from the Lord to have children.
Yeah.
So people in the world are not a detriment, they're not a burden on the world. This is a very Malthusian worldview. So the Malthusian theory is that our, what's the word I'm looking for? Our resources
Yeah.
can only increase additionally, but human population increases exponentially.
Uh-huh.
So we need to bring some form of artificial human population control. Otherwise, we will starve and we
I
will
see.
all die
Yeah.
and things like that. Look at all this mass hunger that's happening. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the Malthusian theory that people are adopting. Margaret Sanger adopted it when she started Planned Parenthood.
Mm.
And that's why she was a big proponent of aborting babies, especially in urban neighborhoods, because she was a huge racist.
Mm.
And she wanted to get rid of as many black and brown babies as she could and things like that. And so these things never lead to good. And when we obey God's commandments and when we live by the precepts that He's given us, there is joy, there's happiness, there's blessing, there's fruit, because these are promises that He's given. So either you believe in the promises or you don't. And now when it comes down to the personal level of how I can plan, I think that all needs to be reflective of what God is saying in His Word. So when people go, oh, okay, we get that you guys talk about these like baseline foundational issues, but what about the actual practicum, the praxis of what we need to do day to day?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the day to day is reflective of what we know that is undergirding our theology.
Yep.
And so we need to make sure that's right. And if that's the case, then it can differ from family to family. Some families may decide that 2 children are good enough because, it's the minimum for replacement, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And for growth. When population decreases, actually it harms society. As many people as we have, even, sociologically speaking, right?
Mm.
When China had the one-child policy and they aborted millions and millions upon millions of babies, they've recognized now that they are headed for a big, big downturn in economics because their population, their working population is all getting older.
Yep.
And there's not enough children to replace them. So they can't keep up with the production and manufacturing that they had.
Mm-hmm.
So now they lifted it. They're going to encourage people to have children and things like that. It's just the way God has designed and ordained the world. And for us to understand it is big. So whether you have 2 or whether you have 16, I think understanding this theological undergirding principle is more important. And you could end up with 16. And I don't think we should laugh at people who have 16 children.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should look down on people who have 2 children because we actually don't know their personal story. I get it if they make it public, like the story that you made, that they are now espousing their theology, they're espousing their philosophy, and that philosophy is bankrupt. It's anti-God, and I do not support any kind of notion that, you can't have more than two children because of some ecological impact, right?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. God holds the world in His hands, and as much as the population has grown, we have always found ways to feed them, and we have found corrupt ways to grow as well. So you can't use that as an argument against the whole response to population growth, saying that, this is why we had corrupt practices. We have corrupt practices if we have a decrease and increase.
Regardless of the population.
Yeah, it's about, were we able to sustain it? And are we able to sustain it in a good way? And the answer is obviously yes. There's innovation up the wazoo because people are trying to feed people. And that's a wonderful thing.
So kind of talking about the environmental issue, we just talked about certain couples deciding not to have more than a specific number of children because of an environmental, I guess, quote unquote, consciousness. And it seems as though our efforts for this environmental agenda has been highly politicized. So how are Christians then supposed to think about caring for the environment? Aren't we as people supposed to be taking care of the earth that God has created. And I believe that was one of the commands that Adam was given. In Genesis 2, we see that Adam was given the command to work and keep the garden, to work it and keep it. This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. And so it seems as though as human beings, we have a responsibility on the creation that God has made. So, how are we supposed to view this environmental agenda? How are we supposed to view taking care of the environment? Is it a sin not to recycle?
Yeah. You read Genesis 2:15, read Malachi 2:15. Oh, that's a nice one. Both 2:15s.
Ah, the beginning and the end. Malachi 2:15?
Yeah, because that's what we do here on this podcast. We type furiously for
When
Bible
choices. Malachi 2:15 reads, "Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth."
So our job is to raise children. One of the key commandments that you see here, especially in the union of marriage, is to raise your children well, to manage your household well. And so those are things that we've been given. And so that's what we take seriously here.
Yeah.
When we talk about like environmental impacts and we want to start limiting children, we want to limit the people that we are going to house because we
Yeah.
want the physical number to go down because we think that's going to help the world.
Right.
There's no
Right.
scientific evidence for this, first of all. And the biblical mandate clearly is against that. So if God blesses you with children, because children are a blessing from the Lord, then I would rejoice. I've constantly said to our young people, if you could have children right away, do it right away, unless there's something, that you need to take care of
Yeah.
physically that is an emergency, like something is really barring you from having children right now.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be something like because I want my career to get, finished or something like that. I disagree with that notion. And I think that's a dangerous kind of precedent to even start your family off of. Like, everything will need to fall in line perfectly. I bet weddings have never worked out like that, right? When people get married, everybody wants to get everything in line perfectly and they don't end up getting married. Or, they get married and it doesn't end up perfect, which is something that we do in faith. We trust in God saying, okay, this is something I need to have faith in and trust in Him, walk obediently in faith. And then God is the one that shows us, He's the one that's going to give me wisdom. He's the one that's going to guide me. And I'm going to be able to handle that. This whole notion about not having children because of some ecological disaster that's about to fall,
Yeah.
that's just not scientific and it's not biblical. And I don't understand why people keep on pushing this when we now clearly see that people are a blessing. And God is the one that grants life.
So what about just, I guess, the environmental agenda just as a whole? I remember, I think it was 2002 when George Bush and Al Gore ran for president. Al Gore talked about global warming, and I had never heard of that before. And
So Al Gore ran in 2000 and
2000.
lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then George Bush beat him.
Yeah, so it was 2000 then. And I was a third grader, I think, something like that. And I had never heard of global warming before. And then, of course, I was deeply concerned for the polar bears. And, this global warming has been a huge topic of debate for a very long time amongst everybody, with everybody. And so I guess, how are we supposed to view that in light of the Genesis chapter 2 command for Adam to work and keep the garden? How are we supposed to think about that? Should Christians be at the forefront of, preserving the earth, recycling, doing all these things? Or, what are we supposed to think about this environmental agenda?
I think number one key thing for Christians to recognize is that God is sovereign. He is in control. Therefore, we shall not be alarmist.
Yeah.
So this alarmism that's coming out is incorrect. It's not Christian. And it pushes you toward a state of anxiety. Look at our Gen Zers who keep on putting up their TikToks or Instagram videos about how the world is going to end in like 10 years. And this was 7 years ago when they were doing this.
Yeah.
The world is going to end in 10 years and it's all you boomers' fault or something like that. Okay, boomer, that kind of thing. And it's all you guys' fault. That's why the world is going to have utter destruction and chaos, and they couldn't go to school. We had someone from, I think, Sweden, right? Who came over
Yeah.
on a ship that they made.
Oh, wow.
So they didn't have to take a plane.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that Greta?
Yeah. So Greta Thunberg came over on a ship that they made to tell the UN, and then she's very famously memed now with the "How dare you," right?
Yeah.
When she was 16, and then obviously all the people that came here on the ship, the pilot, the captain of the ship, everybody, the crew, they all took a plane back. So there's that. Anyway, but everybody was like, the world is going to end. How dare you? And things like that. I think there is global warming. I think that we need to take better care of the world. I don't think that's the biggest thing that that Christians need to be concerned for. The biggest thing Christians need to be concerned for are people who are going to be damned in eternity.
Yeah.
And if you're not preaching the gospel and rather you're preaching this environmental stuff and you're posting about that on your social media rather than posting the gospel, then I think you have big problems. And I know people that's listening to this might not like that. Maybe some of you listeners actually do post about all this environmental stuff and you never really post about the gospel. I think that's a shame. And there is something that is of utter importance and that is urgent. And that is preaching the gospel to those that do not believe. It's not preaching that the world is going to end in 10 years and 7 years later. You got to keep on preaching that because people have been doing that since, from what I read, people have been doing that since the 70s. I'm sure it's been done before. In the 70s and 80s, there were these articles that the media printed about how we're going to have dust cover the skies and, there's not going to be no sunlight because we're polluting so much and things like that.
The ozone.
And then the 80s, it was the ozone. Stop using aerosol spray because the sunlight is going to penetrate. Now we could rebuild ozone. I mean, scientifically, we're that advanced. But it's every decade, it seems to be some kind of new catastrophic climate, some disaster that's going to happen. And then we have to make movies about it. I love watching those movies, by the way, because I love watching movies about dystopian futures. But, like zombies.
Oh, I hate that
so
stuff.
Since we all got vaccinated, now we're all going to turn to zombies.
Oh, no.
But that's not how the world is going to end. The world is going to end when Jesus comes. That is a guarantee. I guarantee you. And so does it mean we should, do whatever we want? Obviously not. We take care of the world as best we can, but we have priorities. And so the same thing with, there are very, very low income families, like the poorest of the poor. What can they afford to eat? And what they can afford to eat isn't very, environmentally friendly at times. It's not always the best for your body. Are you saying they shouldn't eat at all then?
Right.
And so we do our best to raise people's income level. We do our best to educate the poor so that they won't go through that in the next generation. We do our best to do all these things. But most of all, what we do is we preach the gospel. We show them that there is a world beyond this one that they need to be mainly concerned about. And so, that's what we'll continue to do. We could go over some of the scientific stuff about, how we are looking at in the next many decades about that 1.5 Celsius degree increase in the world and how that's going to affect us.
The ice caps
melting and how we'll have to respond to that and how the businesses are responding, how politically we're responding. But Yeah, politically, when people say this is an epidemic, this is something that we need to, be absolutely up in arms about, you have to always see it for what it is, what they're trying to do. They're trying to alarm you so that you give them more power.
Mm.
Yeah, this is a terrible thing. I hope people see right through it. But yeah, we do what we can, and we take what's most important as such.
Thank you for that. I was always wondering about that, you know?
I I've had conversations about this with people whose main field is science,
Yeah.
and I talked to them about it. I've read books on this about how humanity, for the most part, will know how to adjust. Even the rise in sea level,
Yeah,
people
yeah.
are adjusting. Businesses and insurance companies already know how to adjust. That's
Mhm.
why beachfront property insurance levels haven't gone up at all, even though sea level is rising. You have to also see what they've calculated and why they calculated as such, what risks they are taking, because you would imagine that insurance companies would take every single risk factor into account when they
Mhm.
calculate your insurance. And so, what do they know? There's all these books out right now, but I'm sure you can read it if you want to, and you
Mm.
can find it if you want to. But yeah, this isn't a podcast about sea levels rising, right?
Yeah.
And then, some kind of ecological disaster that's imminent. This is not true. I hope people don't fall for this. Gen Zers, please don't fall for this. Yeah. Every generation there are people who always cry out doom and gloom.
Mhm.
And the reason why we are able to survive is we have people that are salt and light in the world who obey God and all his commandments,
Yeah.
who please God. And that's why God sustains this world. So obey God, have children. Sam, you should have 16. And we'll see
That's
how
almost
we'll
3
see what
basketball
happens.
teams.
Yeah.
Yeah, and please recycle. Although it is not a primary, just because the turtles are nice and polar bears are
You just have to
cute.
put the sad music when you show the
Yeah,
polar bear.
they always do that on TV.
It's always about the music. But
Yeah,
yeah, how can we save animals from going into permanent extinction? Things
yeah,
like that are things that people will have a concern over.
right, right, right.
I just think that's healthy. But, then to come back with this alarmist view is unhealthy.
Hmm.
Anytime people have come back with this anxiety ridden solution, it has never boded well for us. It has never gone well for us. And so that's not how we deal with issues here.
Yeah,
And there is a peace that the Lord gives. There is urgency that we speak with when we speak the gospel, but it's not anxiety ridden.
yeah,
And so it's God who takes care of us, and then we do with all our might and diligence to obey his commandments.
yeah. Thank you for that answer. I think it's convicting for all of us. Um, Moving on to something that happened last Sunday, actually on July 11th, the communist regime of Cuba started to crack down on pro-freedom protesters. And we heard about arrests taking place and also internet outages as demonstrators tried to broadcast the protest live with their cell phones through social media. So the government shut down the internet in certain parts of the country so that the protesters would not be able to live broadcast live the protests that were happening. And so the news from the island was being interrupted. And they chanted liberty and freedom, and they also waved an American flag. Jose Vivanco, director of Human Rights Watch America's division, said this concerning this situation. This is pretty massive. My sense is that this is a combination of social unrest based on a lack of freedoms and COVID and economic conditions. The lack of access to electricity, the blackouts, people are screaming for freedom. And in response to what is happening in Cuba, and I thought this was interesting, the New York Times article titled "Cubans Denounce Misery in Biggest Protests in Decades," the opening sentence read, and I quote, "Shouting freedom and anti-government slogans, hundreds of Cubans took to the streets in cities around the country on Sunday to protest food and medicine shortages. in a remarkable eruption of discontent not seen in nearly 30 years. So that's how the New York Times responded with an article. Many on Instagram are protesting, and there was a Black Lives Matter Instagram post, and it's a pretty long post. I'm not going to read it all for us, but the gist of it is the Black Lives Matter movement blames America for the suffering of Cubans, of which 4 million are black and brown, blaming America for the trade embargo, saying that is the reason why they're suffering. So this is a lot. How, as Christians, are we to, when we read news like this and when we have all these different views kind of thrown at us, what do we do? And especially in a situation like Cuba, where there are people protesting for freedom, how do we think through this? How do we pray through this? What do we even do?
Yeah. In 2019, something similar happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
People are crying out for freedom because authoritarian communist regimes destroy families, destroy culture. They oppress people who want to live rightly and freely, which is in our bones. It's in our souls to live in a manner that's free. We want to be free to worship. We want to be free to worship God. We want to be able to share these great ideas, these holy and just precepts that God has given us with the world and live by them. I find it awesome. And also at the same time, the response to what people are doing, very disheartening. So what's awesome is that they're waving the American flag. They waved the American flag in Hong Kong too at the protests. When we talked about, well, I talk about it often on Sunday, but when these Canadian pastors are being jailed and now all these Canadian churches are being burned down, people are coming, asking American senators to help. So this is just a side note, but in Canada, they're burning down churches, regardless of whether it was a Catholic church or not. It doesn't matter. They're just burning down any church because of what they saw what they found or discovered were these mass graves, right? Have you heard about this?
No, I haven't heard about that.
Anyway, long story short, in response to people are just burning up churches, and the government is just very, I don't know, they're just giving lip service, saying, "Oh, please don't do this. This is despicable," or something like that, deplorable.
Yeah.
But they're not doing anything, and so these church leaders are even coming to calling out like United States senators like Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz to help them out. Please say something about this and help, the Canadian government stop. And I don't even know how that's possible, but people look to America for help when there's massive chaos, when there's massive like disruption and there's economic poverty. America is like this beacon of hope. There are people in America, people that I've talked to personally that have said to me that they are not proud of America, that they will never be proud of America. People have gone on the internet, I've seen. Now that's personal, which is surprising, but on the internet I've seen, of course, much more like, like worse things. People have said worse things about America. But in Iran, when the protests were happening a few years back, in Iran, there was a mural on the floor of the American flag. And you can find this video online, but when people were marching and protesting in the streets of Iran, when it came to this huge American flag mural on the street, all the Iranians would walk around it. And so they didn't want to step on the flag. And you could actually see a video of that. People see America as a symbol of liberty and freedom because we were founded on these biblical principles, especially that huge one where all men are created equal. We have unalienable rights that are given to us by our Creator. They have been endowed to us. That means the government cannot dictate what those are. The Bill of Rights were the things that people wanted to write down. And, Hamilton was against this because he thought it was just so obvious. Why do we need to write it? Because writing it would seem like it's not obvious, but we're so glad now that we did write it down. These Bill of Rights that we believe that the government has no control over, like your freedom to gather and to worship God, the freedom of religion, which is obviously now people are trying to, they're undermining in the very least, right? When you don't hire someone that's of LGBTQ proclivity or, preference, orientation, then you can get sued. And, it doesn't matter. You can't use this, what they'll say in the courts, as a religious excuse. Anyway, but coming back to this Cuba matter, this Cuba issue is huge. This demands worldwide attention. They are killing, the government is killing the Cuban residents and its citizens because they don't like the protest, because people are starving, people are dying.
Right.
And then the New York Times is just saying, freedom is an anti-government slogan. How dare they do that? That's so sad.
Yeah.
But it's also the government's response about how it's because of these COVID, they don't have enough vaccines and they don't have enough food. That's why people, it's more than that. And if you interview people in Cuba, they are saying it's more than that. That's why they're not screaming for vaccines. No one's going out into the streets and saying, we want vaccines. No one is saying that. What they are screaming out and chanting is libertad, which means freedom.
Yeah.
And they want freedom because they're tired of what this government in their dictatorial, just the management. This is not a thriving country. And when then President Obama would say good things about Cuba, that's why people were like, what is wrong with you? Why are you saying good things about Cuba? Why are you also lifting up Castro and the Castro family when all they've done is done really terrible things to Cuba?
Yeah.
And this is what Obama, not only Obama, but Bernie Sanders said about Cuba, how everybody can read there, so their education must be so good. And Obama specifically said how he respects what the Cuban government has done because of universal health care. Their life expectancy is just as long as the people in the States. That's why we should also get universal health care. So he was using that as an argument to build upon his push for universal health care and things like that. Anyway, lifting up communist regimes has never looked good, and it won't age well. And it hasn't aged well for these two politicians who've done it. And now, obviously you don't see that being repeated on social media or people defending Cuba, the Castro family and its regime for doing what they're doing to the Cuban citizens. And that's why what Black Lives Matter posted is such a bankrupt, it's such a corrupt kind of statement. That's why people are upset at it. They have such a backwards view on what is good and what is evil. They'll call what is evil good and what is good evil. And I'm still surprised people support this agency. But, if there's something that you can give them credit for, it's just such a great name. What a great name. Black Lives Matter. Who can disagree with that? It's a great name.
Yep.
But everything they stand for is anti-families, anti-authority, unless it's their own kind of chaotic one. It's anti anything God would dictate in his word. And so, we do not support Black Lives Matter, that organization, nor will we ever.
Yeah, and I think the comments were pretty golden. I read through some of the comments, and
that's how you can waste a lot of time too.
Yeah. People saying it's not the embargo, it's the communist regime. That's why the Cubans are suffering. It's this government. I honestly think that the Black Lives Matter movement is possibly the biggest con of our generation. Perhaps rival to Kenneth Copeland. Like you said, they're hiding behind this great name that everyone agrees with and doing just terrible things and implanting terrible ideology into the minds of our young people, especially. And the one way that they do that is through Instagram. And so I wanted to actually ask about Instagram news as well. A couple months ago, there was a lot of Instagram stories up about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
And, people didn't know what to believe because there's so many different sides and people are just always posting these different things, virtue signaling in one way or another. And so I guess, for all of us, I would say the majority of maybe even our listeners are on Instagram or have used or are using Instagram. How do we then wisely navigate the news? Because I think in this day and age, most people get their news from Instagram, at least, under a certain specific age. Everyone gets their news from Instagram. So how do we navigate the news wisely?
Yeah, I wouldn't get my news from Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah.
Or even Twitter for that matter. There is definitely a left-leaning bias. Some would even say it's even more than just left-leaning. It's completely left bias from especially Twitter, but Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Yeah.
And so if you want any kind of balanced news, they'll always tag some kind of warning label on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, because they don't want you to have this fake news or misinformation or disinformation. You look at Real Clear Politics.
Yeah, I do.
So I think that helps. For me, I always find it fascinating that people who continue to get news from these left news, that's why I don't think it's left leaning anymore. It's just left news. It's news from the left, and they want to say this is the standard.
Mm-hmm.
People who are constantly just being not just inundated. This is how just they get their main source of information. When I say, "Oh yeah, why don't you check out Al Mohler's podcast?" They're like, "Oh, I can't listen to him. He's just too conservative." So they just can't even listen to something that's remotely Christian. And these are Christians I'm talking about because they listen to news so much from the left. They've listened or watched or read the New York Times so much.
Yeah.
Everything that the New York Times posts is like it's gold. It's what's right. Like correct, not right, as in politically right, but
the golden standard.
Yeah, and then we have something like the Wall Street Journal, which is like center to center left, sometimes center right, depending on the issue. But it's like center to center left, but people think the Wall Street Journal is right.
Mm.
And so, again, what is, how do you decide? How do you decide what's left, right, center? Don't we decide what's left, right, center by the majority of the population? So if the majority of the population believes something, isn't that really the center? And the left is kind of fringe, the right is kind of fringe. But when we say the majority of the population believes in what the New York Times writes and what they advocate for, and that's the standard, then you absolutely have no idea what the country believes because we do not believe that boys should wear summer dresses.
Right.
We're not like what the Washington Post says where, we should teach kink to our children.
Yep.
That's not center. That's not the standard. That is completely left. And we do not believe the standards that BLM posted on their manifesto and what they believe to be right. That's not center. That's completely left. And so, when we say what's the standard, at least if you're not going to go with the biblical standard, at least the cultural standard should be there. Some kind of knowledge of polls and understanding of where people sit should be there. But, this is just, I think we mentioned this in our last podcast, but this is how the media is going to try to shape culture because they believe this is right.
Yeah.
And so they're just going to say, everybody already believes that. Everybody already believes that boys should wear summer dresses. Everybody already believes that children should be raised under any kind of parenting household, whether it's single mothers or two gay people,
right,
or transgender people. Have you seen this one show? I forgot what it was, but it's a show that Courtney Cox is. No,
I've never seen it. I think I've seen a commercial for it.
It's about families. Yeah, it's about the different kind of families.
Friends. Is it 9 months with Courtney Cox?
That's it.
The 9 months with Courtney Cox?
It's called 9 Months with Courtney Cox. Uh-huh. And I think they already have multiple seasons out already. Yeah. And so there was this one episode that someone showed me about how there's two transgender people.
Uh-huh.
So it's a woman that thinks she's a man, is taking
Okay.
obviously taking hormones for it.
Okay.
And then a man who thinks he's a woman
Okay.
and obviously is taking hormones for it.
Yeah.
So they get pregnant and have a child.
Uh,
And so they were sharing, and the clip I saw was this mom, the mom who doesn't want to be the mom,
Right.
the mom who birthed the child,
yeah.
was crying because she didn't want to put herself as the mom because she believed she was the dad.
I see.
Because you got to put that in the medical records and the birth certificate.
I
right?
see.
And then the dad who wants to play the mom is trying to breastfeed the baby. And then his comments were like, oh, child isn't latching. She's just started to latch, but nothing's being produced.
Right.
So we're supplementing with formula. Like all this language is crazy. You don't supplement when you don't get anything. That's not a supplement. There is no milk being produced. And then so I think in his mind, he really believes that one day he can produce milk. So that's why he would say, I'm not producing milk yet. Right?
I see.
And so like things like this has now become the mainstream. We want to show this as a normative like scenario of a family raising a child. It's not normative. And it's pretty it's like gaslighting again. So people will be like, why are you getting so upset about this? You know, this is just something that a family wants to go through. And you're just like, it's not a family.
Right.
It's just not a family. You can't do that to a child and expect that child to grow up okay. And so, or healthy in any way, physically and emotionally, especially not spiritually. And so when we want to share what's normative, what's good, we want to share what's in the Bible. And I get that most of us don't even know what's going on. Like this might be the first time you've heard about this on this TV show. And I think that's great. That's fine. But, you know, something that we want to make aware is that a huge portion of our population is watching this and they're saying this is a normative thing. This is a regular thing that a family can go through.
Yeah.
That's not true.
So should we just, I mean, you know, I'm reminded of that Denzel quote. If you watch the news, you're misinformed. If you don't watch the news, you're uninformed.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
What do we do? That's the question. I love how he ends the interview with the interviewer is asking, oh, then what do we do? Like you said. And he's like, yeah, what do we do? And so I think, you know, we're doing our best to inform the people that we love the best we can.
Yeah.
And people are going to get shut down. People are going to get, you know, muzzled. And that's why it's important who you vote for. It's important what you teach your children.
Yeah.
It's important what we watch, even in our social media accounts, who you follow. We have to take much more care now than we had to maybe 30 years ago. But even 30 years ago, this was still going on.
Yeah.
So we just have to take much more care now. We can't just willy-nilly follow anybody we want because we like their profile or how they look or the selfies that they take. And so that's not what should dictate who we follow.
Yeah.
Or what entertains us. I think that's a big one, right? If this person can do it entertainingly, then we'll follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can always guise misinformation or disinformation through entertainment. So watch out for that. But yeah, there's other news options out there, like the website you recommended, Real Clear Politics. You can actually see what all these news agencies are putting out and decide for yourself. But yeah, I find it fascinating. Like the Israel-Palestine issue was huge just like 2 months ago. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was emotional about it. Everybody had an opinion about it. And then, you know, people have even come up to me. And so I needed to explain to them what private transactions were, what contracts were, what people had to do to get to the place where they were now, what evictions and what the law did in that country to where they ended up. And we explained that a lot. But look at people now.
No one
They
cares.
don't care. They don't care.
Yeah.
Right. And so what did they end up with? you ended up with, if all you watched was the mainstream media's report on the Israel and Palestine issue, you just ended up with hate, bitterness, anger toward the issue, not resolved, and you
Yep.
moved on to the next one.
Yep.
So that still stays with you. And that stays with you. And every time I mention Israel and Palestine, even if you know zero facts about what's happening, even today, about the elections that are happening and the runoffs that happened like 4 times in a row, and how there's a coalition of other minority parties that came together to basically overthrow Netanyahu and all these. If you're not in with the Israeli politics, then you just remember what happened with Palestine
Yep.
and the Iron Dome. Maybe you saw some pictures about the Iron Dome, and you just ended up angry, and you ended up with no new facts. This is what makes me a little sad. And so if people want to really know, and if you really are concerned about Israel and Palestine, then reach out to people that know and get the information rightly. It's sad that we won't get it from New York Times. It's sad we won't get it from the Washington Post. But that's just reality now. You can't just be angry at the New York Times for putting up their biased version of the news, because if you don't know that by now, I don't know where you've been hiding under.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, I think it definitely is difficult trying to wisely navigate the news. And that's the purpose of why we're recording these episodes as well. Is because, when we read these types of stories, we want to make sure that as Christians, we have a Christian worldview as we view the different stories that we're bombarded with. And so I want to go back to the topic of Cuba, and, speaking of the downfall of Cuba, the downfall of the communist regime. And we've been talking about China and Hong Kong as well, just on the side. When we look at these regimes, should we be, as Christians, praying for their downfall? And, I also ask because it seems that every quote unquote regime has their sins, right? So even democracy, sure, on paper, we may not be quote unquote sinful, but in its practice, it is corrupt. And a lot of times people accuse America of being greedy, too greedy. Our capitalist society is way too greedy, and we don't want to share. And we just all care about number one, right? We just care about Americans. So how are we supposed to pray for the downfall of another country, or not another country, I'm sorry, but another government form, when we ourselves have sins within our system as well? I know it's a lot of questions, but I guess first and foremost, should we be praying for the downfall of communist regimes?
I love how Martin Luther prays, and we've done Martin Luther's prayers in our church too, and John Calvin's prayers. And now we're going over Puritan prayers that you can join us on Saturday morning for. But as we read these prayers, we see how the Bible has informed prayers, how it still informs our prayers today. The way Martin Luther prayed was, if there is a leader, he would pray for the leader, the king. And he would pray that the king would come to know and fear God, because then the king could rightly judge and rightly reign, right? And then he'll pray if the king doesn't know God, and then will go against his precepts, for God to replace him quickly rather than later. Because the longer a corrupt politician or leader stays in power, the more the nation will be corrupted. And we see this happening even today. When you continue to advocate for abortion, we see millions and millions upon millions of children dying and being killed. This is not what we advocate for. And so those things are on our minds, and it's on our prayers. May God change the heart of even our president, so that he come to know and fear God, because he obviously does not fear God.
Right.
And people's response to that is, well, did the previous president fear God? And what does that have to do with our current president fearing and knowing God? Does that excuse our current president? Obviously it doesn't. So whether it's the previous president, we still prayed for him, right? And our current president, we still should pray for him. And if he doesn't come to know and fear God, and continues to push and advocate and execute these terrible, demonic, ungodly, anti-Christian policies, then we pray for God's mercy to get him out of office ASAP,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So that he doesn't destroy our country even more. And so those are things that I think we could pray for. But I think the best case scenario is this person come and turn to God. There will be a right fear in him, knowing
Mhm.
that he is an instrument that God can move in whatever way he wants. Like it says in the Proverbs that he can just, the king is like a brook in God's hand. He can just
Oh yeah.
turn
Yeah.
it whichever way he pleases.
Yeah.
And so rather than turning the king to destruction, may he turn the king to repentance, because when the king goes into destruction, guess what? The country will also suffer greatly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we always pray for our leaders, whether it's on the national scale or the local scale, but especially in our church scale, where you pray for the elders of your church, because if the elders mess up, if they become corrupt, the church will be shaken 100%, right? So you want to continue to pray for the leaders that have been given authority over you.
As we are praying for Cuba, what would be the best way that we could pray for them? You just talked about praying for godly leaders, and we believe that God can change the heart of any man. And so, we know that God can change the heart of the leaders in Cuba. So, is that what we should be praying about? How should we be praying for this country and just this situation that they're going through right now?
So Cuban refugees, people who have escaped Cuba, I think Pitbull is one of them. He put
Oh,
a
wow.
Instagram
The
video up.
artist.
Yeah.
I think he's Mr. Worldwide. Oh, is that Sean
Yeah.
Paul?
No.
No, Mr. Worldwide. Yeah, Pitbull.
But yeah, he put out an Instagram video just saying, you got to support Cuba. You got to, want freedom for them. Every single nation should be involved. I
Yeah.
mean, people who have escaped Cuba know.
Right.
Like Ted Cruz and his family, they escaped Cuba. People
Mm.
know. I think Marco Rubio is one of them. It's interesting, though, that Cuban refugees, people who have escaped Cuba, always tend to lean conservative and more toward freedom,
Mm.
right? Rather
Mm.
than the government taking over. So people who want the government to take over are people who have lived here for a long time.
Mm.
But people escaping communist regimes never want the country to become communist. People who have escaped China, people who have escaped any kind of political persecution. But we should pray, and we ought to pray as they're asking us to help. They're asking us to help pray that the country be free from this dictatorial grasp, right, that they have
Right.
on them. And so, yeah, that's what we should pray for. That's what they want us to pray for. And so I would think that's how we can support them. This is, and I honestly think this is huge, because JFK could not do it. And it has come all the way down to now in our current day society, like 70 years later, about how Cuba is just a, destabilizing force in the West. And now the whole country is up in arms, wanting freedom because they're all dying of poverty over there. And so, yeah, I hope we can pray for them and the citizens of the nation who are desperately crying out for help. People are trying to come over. They're making these makeshift rafts. They're opening up cars, and they're trying to float it down so that they can maybe float down to the States.
Yeah.
And is it the Department of Homeland Security? The director come out and say, "Don't come here anymore." Right. So obviously, for certain migrants, they're welcome, as other migrants are not welcome. But yeah, it's a desperate situation there right now, and with the government shooting their own people when they protest, that is very, very bad news. And I even heard where people who are reporting what's going on, if they're not pro-government reporters, in the middle of their reporting, people are coming, like state or the government's police, their military is coming up and arresting them in the middle of their reporting. That's pretty crazy down there right now. Like it was pretty crazy in Hong Kong in 2019. But it's so sad that these countries who are suffering so much from all these authoritarian regimes who, they're just terrible people. But the people, when they cry out for help, they're crying out for freedom. They're looking to the U.S. for help. there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And I hope people recognize it.
Yeah, it's a sobering kind of story, I think, especially when we are just inundated with all these, America is awful, we hate America news from within America. And then we hear of other countries um, wanting, wishing, praying to be here because of the freedoms that we enjoy here. And so I hope that, we would be able to take this time and be grateful for the freedoms that we have here in this country. And also, we ask that you would join us to pray for the country of Cuba and just the terrible things that are going on and the things that they're enduring, that God would free the people there from this oppressive regime. We thank you for listening to this episode of the Dear Church podcast. Join us next week as we actually will be talking about the COVID Delta strain. I think
by next week, it could be the Epsilon. I've already read articles about the Epsilon strain.
So whatever strain is upon us, that is what we will talk about, the COVID blank strain. And also, there have been some questions that have been coming in. And so we wanted to answer some of those as well. We hope and pray that this has been a blessing in your ears, as always, and until the end of time. We love you. We miss you. Bye.